What's up, guys? My name's Brandon and welcome back to Apple Weekly. In this episode, we're going to cover iOS 16.4 Beta 1 and some more new features and changes included, along with a very strange update to iOS 16.3.1 in terms of the security changelog. And then after discovering the software, we're going to talk about the exclusive iPhone 15 color that could be coming later this year, a game-changing feature that could be coming to the Apple Watch sooner than later, new Apple products coming in March, why you might want to reconsider using your iPhone's passcode in public, and much more. And as always, if you guys want to stay updated with all things Apple, make sure to click that subscribe button down below so you don't miss next week's episode. All right, so let's start with iOS 16.4 Beta 1 because I showed you guys a ton of new features in my original What's New video, and then even more new features in last week's Apple Weekly episode. But as you guessed it, there are even more changes included in this update. And this is, perhaps the biggest update to iOS 16 yet. So the first change has to do with connecting to a public Wi-Fi network, and you will see that now in 16.4, your iPhone will recommend you to connect to your VPN if it notices you're on an insecure network. So that is new. Shout out to a Reddit user for this screenshot. Now, something I wanted to add on to that is because of the new shortcut in 16.4 where we can set a VPN, you could take this even further. So this, of course, the set VPN script right here, this action is also brand new in 16.4 Beta 1, but you could take that feature further by having an automation set up to when you connect to Wi-Fi, it will check for known networks, and if it doesn't find a match to a known network in your phone, it can turn on the VPN or set VPN, and you can have it set to turn on. Pretty awesome stuff, and Shortcuts is just continuing to get even more powerful here with 16.4. We also have a change with Emergency SOS via satellite for the iPhone 14 series, so it now shows when the next satellite will pass. The music application also gets quite a few changes here in 16.4, and pretty much the biggest one is when you go to play next, or when you do any type of action, you get a much smaller glyph icon now down there at the bottom. That animation is significantly smaller than the one that took up the entire screen. It also doesn't last as long when it pops up. It goes away quicker than the previous animation. And then also when you go to love a song, you will notice that we do get a little love icon down here as well. So that is new. Also on the now playing screen, if you tap on the three dots, you will see that bottom option that says suggest less. Before, it said suggest less like this. So Apple just took out the like this part to make that easier to read. We also have a minor change inside of our settings for sounds and haptics. So if we go to the sounds and haptic settings, you can see that personalized spatial audio has now been moved to the top right here. So it's easier to access that. It seems as though Apple is trying to promote this more and get more people to personalize their spatial audio setup. Now, something else I noticed in the podcast application is if we go to the library and go to latest episodes, you will see that it now shows the exact time that that podcast was published. So 8 hours ago, 14 hours ago, 21 hours ago, instead of just saying today. So the same podcasts are right here on 16.3.1 on the left, and you can see on 16.4, it shows the exact time in terms of hours and doesn't just say today. Game Center also gets a new splash screen in 16.4 Beta 1, so when you go into a game that uses Game Center for the first time, you will notice a new splash screen that looks like this. Now, perhaps the biggest change coming in 16.4, aside from the emojis, of course, because that's always the biggest feature, is going to be the massive changes to Safari's WebKit. So, I've seen a lot of developers give pretty positive responses to all of these new WebKit changes, including Safari web notifications, badging, and add to home screen from third-party browsers. And just take a look at this graph here. You can see the changelog for WebKit is absolutely massive compared to any other previous iOS version. So this is definitely going to be the biggest update in iOS history in terms of WebKit changes. And 9to5Mac found something pretty interesting in the code of 16.4 Beta 1, and they found a new device class that says compute module. So they're saying that it could be related to an upcoming Mac Pro, a processor box for the Reality Pro headset, or even a Raspberry Pi-like device. And something else found in the code by Steve Moser was something I found pretty interesting, and it's that Apple is working on a new smart reply for my flight lands at X. So I guess Apple is going to use, when you type that in, it's going to use the data on your device, maybe in your calendar or any other application, and it will be able to read that and give you an autocorrect field for when your flight is going to land. It's similar to the smart reply when you type "I'm at" and it pulls up current location right there. So you can just tap on that and it will send that person your current location without having to do anything further. Now let's move on to iOS 16.3.1. And before we get to that really strange addition to the security notes, let's first talk about a big bug that's plaguing a lot of users on 16.3.1, and that's related to HomePods. Obviously HomePods and the home application has been an absolute nightmare for a while now, ever since 16.2. So it's not surprising that we have this issue where multiple HomePods are responding to Siri requests at the same time. Okay, so now let's talk about that security change, because as you guys know, 16.3.1 was a relatively minor update. I mean, we did get quite a few bug fixes, but I think the main reason Apple pushed out 16.3.1 to begin with was to patch up the 2 exploits that were listed on the security page the day that 16.3.1 was released, and one of those was being actively exploited, which meant that some users were maybe getting hacked out in the wild. So that would, of course, would be plenty of reason to release that update. However, just this past week, Apple actually added an additional CVE onto that security page. But not only that, Apple also added 3 additional CVEs for iOS 16.3, which was the software that was released in January. And for 16.3.1, it is a security bug that shows the impact as processing a maliciously crafted certificate may lead to a denial of service. And that's pretty interesting because that has to do with a certificate that can be installed on a user's device. And then for 16.3, you can see there are 3 additional ones that have been added to these release notes or the security notes. The first one is related to the crash reporter, and it says the impact is a user may be able to read arbitrary files as root. And then there are 2 foundation bugs that were being exploited, where an app may be able to execute arbitrary code out of its sandbox or with certain elevated privileges. So that is very interesting for Apple to add these way after the fact. And they have been transparent about this. You can see it shows in little gray text down there that the entry was added on February 20th. But still, that's pretty interesting. It kind of makes you wonder why Apple didn't mention these, before now. What was the reason? Did they not know they were fixed? Did they not know that they were even patched? That also makes you wonder how many exploits are actually out there that Apple doesn't even know about if they don't know that they're patching certain exploits. So you guys remember when iOS 16.2 released and everybody was up in arms about this feature right here, AirDrop only being allowed to be enabled for everyone for just 10 minutes instead of indefinitely? Well, that's actually for good reason, because just this past week, there was a bomb threat made by a teenager on an airline, like on a flight, mid-flight. He sent a bomb threat to people on the plane via AirDrop. And I'm guessing that a lot of those people were not updated to 16.2, otherwise he would not have been able to send that to them. All right, so now let's talk about what to expect next from Apple. So just as expected, Apple did skip this week, so we did not get a 16.4 beta. However, I would expect that to change next week because I do think we're gonna see 16.4 beta 2 next week, most likely right there on Tuesday, February 28th, the final day of February, although it could come really anytime next week. Now, as far as the final release for 16.4, I'm still expecting that in late March, potentially early April. And again, this will somewhat depend on if Apple is going to have a spring Apple event or not. And then as for a 16.3.2, again, as I mentioned in last week's episode, don't expect a 16.3.2. I still think that 16.4 is going to be the next public release that drops, and that's going to be next month. I don't see any reason for Apple to release a 16.3.2 unless there is a big security vulnerability that is being actively exploited out in the wild or some other major bug. Now let's move on to the latest Apple news, and let's start with a banger, the new exclusive color for this year's iPhone. So according to a scoop from 9to5Mac, the iPhone 15 Pro's exclusive color is going to be red. But don't get disappointed yet, because it's nothing like the product red that we've seen on Apple products for years. You can see it's more of a wine red. And I actually really like this. I think it looks good in the render if it turns out to be this exact color. But one thing to keep in mind is that the body is expected to be titanium this year, so that could lead to a more subdued color given the materials used. And then as for the standard iPhone 15 and 15 Plus, we could see either a light blue or a pink color. And I think a pink is needed a lot more than light blue because, we've had too many variations of blue over the past few years, as you can see on my desk right here. So I don't think we need another blue color, but a pink could look good as long as they do it right. And speaking of the iPhone 15, we might also be getting a big change internally, and that is more RAM, at least for the Pro models. So according to TrendForce, the 15 Pro and Pro Max might get 8 gigabytes of RAM, while the regular 15 and 15 Plus will remain at 6 gigabytes, but those models might get upgraded DDR5 RAM like the 14 Pros did last year. And this is noteworthy because the Pro iPhones have been sitting on 6 gigabytes of RAM ever since the iPhone 12 Pro multiple years ago. So this will be a nice upgrade if it does happen and will be great for better multitasking and more. As for the iPhone 15's display, a new report from the Economic Daily News claims that the OLED display driver chip is going to be shifting from a 40 nanometer to a 28 nanometer process. And this would lead to better efficiency and better battery life. So let's hope that we get a solid battery upgrade across the board this year, thanks to better displays and of course the chip inside as well. Now let's move on to a game-changing feature that might be coming to the Apple Watch sooner than we think. A no-prick blood glucose tracking feature. According to Mark Gurman, Apple is testing a feature that would allow diabetics and others to test their blood glucose levels without needing to prick the skin with a needle for blood testing. Apple's system, which is more than 12 years in the making, is now considered to be at a proof of concept stage, but they need the technology to be shrunk down to a more practical size. So engineers are working to develop a prototype device about the size of an iPhone that can be strapped to a person's bicep. One of Apple's goals for the technology is to create a preventative measure that warns people if they're pre-diabetic. And it seems that this feature is less than 10 years away at this point, and quite possibly even less than 5 years away. And if Apple can pull this off, it will be absolutely massive. And if you want to read the specific details about this, I will leave this article linked in the description below. It's pretty interesting how the technology is expected to work. Now let's talk about what we might be seeing at the spring event this year, if Apple actually holds one. So according to a recent filing, Apple just filed a new listing in the Bluetooth Launch Studio database, and it doesn't give any specifics, but it does list Bluetooth 5.3 and references a prior macOS related listing. So this could be indicative of a new Mac that is incoming. And as you know from previous Apple Weekly episodes, those new Macs could be a 12-inch and a 15-inch MacBook Air with the M2 chip, or a new Mac Pro with that all-new M2 Ultra chip, both of which could be announced within the next month or two, although I would say the MacBook Air is significantly more likely to come in the next couple of months. However, there is also a possibility that we just see all of these products, including the headset, at the Worldwide Developers Conference, and we don't get a spring event at all. But I would say that's a little bit less likely at this point. I have a feeling we are going to see an Apple event next month because it's pretty rare for Apple to not host an event in the spring. Okay, we need to talk about iPhone passcodes and why entering your code in a public setting could quite literally ruin your life. The Wall Street Journal just published a report that gives insight into the recent trend of iPhone thefts that go much deeper than just stealing somebody's iPhone. And that's because these thieves are strategic. They watch you and they wait for you to enter your iPhone's passcode, and then they not only steal the phone, but also gain access to your phone and all of the apps that you're signed into, including, yes, your banking applications. So in some cases, these thieves have even changed the Apple ID on the phone, making it impossible for the original owner to track it down. The report opens with a story about a woman from New York who had this happen to her. In the early hours of Thanksgiving weekend, Rayhan was leaving a bar in Midtown Manhattan when a man she had just met snatched her iPhone 13 Pro Max. Within a few minutes, the 31-year-old could no longer get into her Apple account and all of the stuff attached to it, including photos, contacts, and notes. Over the next 24 hours, about $10,000 vanished from her bank account. And there have been hundreds of these sorts of crimes in the city in the past 2 years. And if you're wondering how this works, not on the iPhone, but just like tricking you while you're out in public at a bar, the thieves often work in groups with one person distracting the victim while another one looks over their shoulder as they enter their passcode. Others have been known to even befriend victims, asking them to open social media or other apps of their phones so they can watch and memorize the password before for stealing it. And there was actually a 12-person crime ring in Minnesota that was just recently taken down after targeting iPhones like this in bars, and almost $300,000 was stolen from 40 victims before they were caught. And the glaring issue here is that Apple allows you to change the Apple ID password with just the device passcode itself. And I think this needs to require the Apple ID or, maybe something more, because if you go into your settings here, not only can you just go down and see your passwords by simply tapping on passwords, just enter in your device passcode and you get access to it, but also when you go into your Apple ID and then to password and security, all you have to do is tap on change password up top, and it's going to allow you to change the passcode by just simply entering in your 4 or 6 digit passcode for your iPhone. And if you don't want this to happen to you, set a long passcode or just simply do not enter your actual passcode while out in public anywhere. Just use Face ID or Touch ID and that's it. Don't enter your passcode anywhere where anybody else around you can see you, especially if you're at a bar and you just met somebody, just keep it to yourself. Turn your iPhone away and then put in your passcode if you need to, because you never know with people these days. Now, speaking of bars, have you ever been to an Apple store? If you have, they're pretty large, but a new one is being built in Miami that is going to blow whatever store you've been in out of the water. And that's because a new Apple store is currently being built in Miami, and it is rumored to be the biggest Apple store ever built. You can see here on Twitter, according to a trusted source, Apple just signed a lease at Miami World Center to build the largest Apple store in the world. Exact location is to be determined, but almost certainly in the Jewelry Box on Northeast 8th and 1st Avenue. So I'm sure we're going to hear more about this soon, but you better believe I'll be there for that grand opening if and when that day comes. Now it's time for yet another Apple Watch saving lives story. This time, a Redditor shared a story about how they would have passed out and died without the Apple Watch on their wrist. Last week, I had my iPhone and watch on Do Not Disturb for work, and when I went on lunch, I was kind of tired, so I laid down on my couch for a quick nap. After the nap, I checked my notifications and had at least 10 that my pulse was racing. I called out for the rest of the day and tried to lay around, but it didn't stop. So I scheduled a quick video with my doctor. My doctor had me check the times and pulse rates, had me check the oxygen, and then went ahead and called 911 for me. Turns out they had severe internal bleeding, and the EMS originally said that it was a heart attack, but it was GI bleeding. They said that if I had not gotten there for a transfusion when I did, I'd not have made it. So bless the nurses, doctors, and the people who gave blood and everybody who helped work on me, but I just have passed out and died without ever knowing, if not for my Apple Watch. Now that is pretty awesome stuff, and just another reason I wear my watch now all day, every day. And then finally, do you remember opening a brand new sealed iPhone 2G back in the day? No, maybe an iPhone 3G, 3GS, 4. Well, just know that if you would have bought an extra one and held on to it to this day, you would multiply your money several times over. And I say this to bring up the most recent auction for a sealed original iPhone 2G, and this one is actually the highest selling iPhone ever to be sold at auction. The auction, which was of course held by LCG Auctions, got 27 bids and ended at a staggering $63,000. That is 105 times the original $599 price tag. That is insane. It blew away the previous record, which I also covered here on Apple Weekly. And the cool part about this is that the iPhone's original owner was actually given this phone as a gift from her friends in 2007, but never used it since iPhones at the time could only be used on AT&T, and she didn't have AT&T. So she just left the phone unopened for the past 15 years, and now it's worth over $60,000. That is wild. So there you have it. That is the latest batch of Apple news from this past week, along with some updates on the latest iOS 16 changes. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode as always. If you did, I would appreciate if you gave it a thumbs up. Also, make sure to subscribe for more Apple Weekly episodes. But anyways, guys, thanks again for watching, and I'll see you soon.